What's the most disturbing thing hiding in plain sight? Story 1. In the 1970s and into the 1980s, the Church of Scientology conducted what federal prosecutors later described as the largest infiltration of the United States government by a private organization in the country's history. This is not a theory. It's in court records, guilty pleas, and sentencing documents filed in U.S. federal courts. Operation Snow White, as the church's internal documents called it, involved placing Scientology operatives inside multiple federal agencies, most significantly the Internal Revenue Service and the Department of Justice, with the specific aim of stealing and destroying documents about the church. 11 Scientology officials were convicted in 1979-1980, including Mary Sue Hubbard, the wife of the church's founder. The convictions were for theft, burglary, and obstruction of justice. The scale was significant. The church maintained agents across approximately 136 agencies and organizations. The operatives stole documents from government files, had them copied and sent to Scientology intelligence headquarters, and in some cases planted forged documents in government files. This happened inside the ears, inside the Justice Department, inside the DEA, inside the FBI. The church's internal intelligence apparatus, the Guardian's Office, later replaced by the Office of Special Affairs, operated like an intelligence agency, with cover identities, surveillance protocols, and a systematic program for gathering information about enemies and potential threats. Mary Sue Hubbard and the other convicted officials served prison sentences. Ron Hubbard was named as an unindicted co-conspirator, but was never charged, having gone into hiding in 1979, where he remained until his death in 1986. This is in the federal court record. The documents are public. The convictions are a matter of American legal history. Operation Snow White happened. Story 2. In March 2017, WikiLeaks began publishing what it called Vault 7, what it described as the CIA's cyber espionage toolkit. The 8,761 documents and files represented, according to WikiLeaks, the largest ever publication of confidential documents from the CIA. The CIA neither confirmed nor denied the authenticity of the material, which is itself a form of confirmation. What the documents described, the CIA had developed or acquired capabilities to hack Samsung smart televisions, keeping them in a fake-off state while using the microphone to record conversations in the room. The program was called Weeping Angel, developed in cooperation with British intelligence MI5. The documents describe tools for compromising iPhones and Android devices. They describe techniques for attacking vehicle control systems. The document discussing this specifically noted the CIA was considering the possibility of covert assassination through vehicles with internet-connected controls. They describe techniques for making cyber attacks look like they came from other countries, including Russia. The whistleblower who provided the material, Joshua Schulte, a former CIA employee, was subsequently convicted of espionage and sentenced to 40 years in prison. His defense argued he had not been the source. The jury did not accept this argument. The specific claim that intelligence agencies might be able to use smart devices to listen to conversations in private homes moved from conspiracy theory to confirmed by leaked CIA documents in March 2017. The CIA's official position is that its intelligence collection activities are conducted under legal authorization and oversight. The full scope of what was in Vault 7 and what capabilities the CIA currently has is not publicly known. You are reading this on a device. The device has a microphone. Story 3. Thomas Drake was a senior NSA executive who believed his agency had made a catastrophic and corrupt decision. In the aftermath of September 11, the NSA had faced a critical choice: implement ThinThread, a surveillance system developed internally that could analyze communications patterns while automatically encrypting and protecting the data of American citizens, or implement a more expensive system called Trailblazer that had been contracted to outside companies at enormous cost and provided less privacy protection. The NSA chose Trailblazer. ThinThread was shelved. The outside contracts worth billions of dollars were awarded. Trailblazer eventually failed as a program and was abandoned at additional cost, having never achieved its technical objectives. Drake believed this decision was made partly for financial reasons. The private contractors who benefited from Trailblazer had relationships with NSA leadership, and partly to create a surveillance capability that was less constrained by privacy protections than ThinThread would have been. He tried to report this through internal channels. He went to the NSA's Inspector General. He went to the Congressional Intelligence Committees. Nothing happened. He spoke to a Baltimore Sun reporter. The reporter published a series of stories about NSA waste and mismanagement in 2006-2007. In 2010, Drake was charged under the Espionage Act with 10 counts that could have resulted in 35 years in prison. He was prosecuted as a spy for talking to a journalist about a failed government program. The case collapsed. The government withdrew its most serious charges rather than disclose classified information in court. Drake pleaded to a misdemeanor. A judge described the government's prosecution as unconscionable. ThinThread's developer, William Binney, subsequently became a well-known privacy advocate. The NSA surveillance capability that replaced ThinThread is documented in the Snowden leaks. Story 4. Between 2009 and 2011, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives ran an operation called Fast and Furious, a gun-walking scheme in which ATF agents intentionally allowed illegally purchased firearms to be transported across the Mexican border by straw purchasers working for drug cartels. The rationale: by allowing the guns to move, ATF hoped to trace them up the cartel supply chain to the buyers and organizers at higher levels. The operation allowed approximately 2,000 weapons to cross the border. The ATF lost track of most of them. The guns began appearing at crime scenes. In December 2010, U.S. Border Patrol agent Brian Terry was ended near the Arizona border. 2 weapons found near his body were traced to the Fast and Furious program. The discovery prompted whistleblowers within the ATF to contact congressional investigators, and the existence of the program became public. The subsequent investigation found that internal ATF concerns about the operation, specific documented objections from agents who believed allowing the weapons to walk was dangerous, had been overridden by supervisors who prioritized the investigative strategy over the agents' safety concerns. Attorney General Eric Holder was cited for contempt of Congress for refusing to provide additional documents about the operation. This was the first time in American history that a sitting cabinet member was held in contempt by the House. The Department of Justice's Office of the Inspector General found that the operation reflected a series of misguided strategies, tactics, errors in judgment, and management failures. The senior officials responsible for the operation were allowed to retire rather than face discipline that would have ended their federal employment. The guns are still out there. Story 5. The Iran-Contra Affair is the documented story of how the Reagan administration, between 1986 and 1987, simultaneously conducted 2 secret operations that were each independently problematic and combined to constitute one of the most significant constitutional crises in post-war American history. The first operation, the United States secretly sold arms to Iran, which was subject to an arms embargo. The rationale was to obtain Iranian assistance in freeing American hostages held in Lebanon by groups with Iranian connections. This was a sale of weapons to a government the United States officially considered a state sponsor of terrorism, conducted in violation of an arms embargo, conducted without congressional notification. The second operation, the profits from the arms sales were secretly diverted to fund the Nicaraguan Contras, the rebel group fighting the Sandinista government, in direct violation of the Boland Amendment, a law passed by Congress explicitly prohibiting federal funding for the Contras. The diversion was arranged by National Security Council staffer Oliver North. North was convicted on 3 counts, including aiding and abetting obstruction of Congress. The convictions were overturned on appeal because his congressional testimony, given under a grant of immunity, may have tainted the trial proceedings. He was never retried. President Reagan stated in a national address that he had not known about the diversion. His national security advisor, John Poindexter, testified that he had made the decision to divert funds without telling the president. Whether Reagan knew is disputed and was not resolved by the subsequent investigation. 11 administration officials were convicted of various offenses. 6 were pardoned by President George H.W. Bush on Christmas Eve 1992. Shortly before he left office, the pardons included Caspar Weinberger, who had been charged with 4 counts of false statements and perjury. The pardons closed the investigation. The full scope of what was known and by whom has never been established. Story 6 Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty broadcast news and commentary into Soviet bloc countries throughout the Cold War, presenting themselves as independent operations funded by private American donations. A voice for free information in countries where state media controlled the narrative. They were popular with audiences behind the Iron Curtain who had limited access to uncensored news. For approximately 2 decades, they were funded and directed by the CIA. This was not publicly known. The broadcasters presented themselves as independent. Their funding was channeled through a series of front organizations that obscured its origin. The CIA directed the programming to serve American intelligence and foreign policy objectives. The operation was publicly exposed in 1967 when Ramparts magazine published an investigation into CIA funding of the National Student Association. A separate operation. The CIA's use of front organizations to fund cultural and media operations became a major story, and the Radio Free Europe funding was acknowledged in 1971. The revelations raised a specific question that has never been fully resolved. What does it mean for the credibility of media operations to have been covertly funded by an intelligence agency? The broadcasters did provide genuinely useful news coverage to people living under censorship. They also served the strategic interests of the agency that paid for them. Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty are still broadcasting. They are now funded openly through the U.S. Agency for Global Media, a government body. Their operational independence from government direction is more clearly defined than it was during the CIA years. Whether the audiences who relied on them during the Cold War would have trusted them as fully had they known the source of funding is a question the revelation never answered. The CIA operation created a media brand built on independence. The independence was partly real and partly constructed. Story 7 The Gardner Museum Heist. $500 million in art was stolen in 1990, and the empty frames still hang on the wall on March 18, 1990. 2 men dressed as Boston police officers knocked on the door of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston at 1:23 a.m. The security guard who buzzed them in was new to the job and had a prior criminal record that the museum had failed to check during hiring. The men said they were responding to a disturbance call. They asked the guard to step away from the security button. He did. Over the next 81 minutes, the men stole 13 works of art, Vermeer's The Concert, 3 Rembrandts including his only known seascape, 5 Degas drawings, a Manet, a Flink, and other pieces. The total value is estimated above $500 million, making it the largest art theft in history by value. The thieves left behind works by Raphael and Michelangelo that would have been even more valuable. They spent time selecting specific pieces and left others. They stole the Napoleonic finial from a flagstaff. They cut paintings out of frames. They left the frames. The frames still hang in the museum today, empty. Isabella Stewart Gardner's will specified that the collection must be displayed exactly as she arranged it. The empty frames are part of the collection now, the permanent record of the theft, visible to every visitor. The FBI has investigated continuously for over 3 decades. The leading theory, supported by circumstantial evidence but never proven, involves the Boston mob, specifically associates of James Whitey Bulger, possibly working with a buyer in Europe. The art has never been recovered. The thieves have never been charged. The reward for information leading to the recovery of the paintings is $10 million, unclaimed. Story 8. On September 16, 1890, Louis Le Prince boarded a train from Dijon to Paris. He never arrived. He was never found. His luggage was not found. No other passenger reported seeing anything unusual. He simply ceased to exist somewhere between Dijon and Paris. Le Prince, a French-British inventor, had been working on motion picture technology and had made films that predate Thomas Edison's commercially recognized developments by several years. In October 1888, he filmed a sequence of images in Leeds, England, using a camera he had patented. The Roundhay garden scene, a 2.11-second film of people walking in a garden, is now considered one of the earliest surviving motion picture films. The sequence was filmed using Le Prince's camera approximately 2 years before Edison's kinetoscope was operational. Le Prince had been planning to demonstrate his invention publicly in New York and then in England. He had booked passage. He had arranged the demonstration. And then, he vanished from a train. The timing has attracted speculation across 130 years. Edison's company subsequently dominated the early film industry and spent years in legal disputes over patents. Le Prince's son Adolphe appeared as a witness in patent proceedings, advocating for his father's priority as inventor. In 1902, Adolphe Le Prince was found dead on Long Island in circumstances officially attributed to drowning. No charges were filed. Whether Louis Le Prince drowned, was murdered, or disappeared voluntarily has never been established. The specific circumstances of a man who may have invented cinema vanishing days before his planned public debut have never been explained. The Lumiere brothers are credited with the first public film exhibition in 1895. Le Prince's films predate theirs. Le Prince was gone. Story 9. The murder of Marilyn Shepard. A doctor was convicted, acquitted, and the real killer has never been found. On July 4, 1954. Marilyn Shepard was beaten to death in the bedroom of the family's home in Bay Village, Ohio. Her husband, Sam Shepard, a prominent osteopathic surgeon, said he had been asleep on the couch when he heard her screaming, went upstairs, and was knocked unconscious by an intruder who he described as a bushy-haired man, and woke to find her dead. Sam Shepard was tried for murder, convicted in 1954, and sentenced to life in prison. The trial was conducted in a media environment so chaotic that the Supreme Court later cited it as a landmark case in media interference with a fair trial. The judge received hundreds of pieces of fan mail supporting conviction before the verdict. In 1966, the Supreme Court overturned Shepard's conviction in Shepard v. Maxwell, finding the trial had been conducted in conditions that denied him due process. He was retried and acquitted. He died in 1970. His son Sam Rees Shepard spent decades pursuing the case, believing the real killer was Richard Eberling, a window washer who had worked in the Shepard home and who was later convicted of another murder. DNA testing of evidence from the original crime scene was conducted. The results were inconclusive or contested in different analyses. The case directly inspired the television series and film The Fugitive, the story of a doctor wrongly convicted of his wife's murder while searching for the real killer. The fictional version had a resolution. The real case does not. Marilyn Shepard was murdered. Her killer was never conclusively identified. The case remains formally open. Story 10. On November 19, 1961, a catamaran carrying Michael Rockefeller, son of New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, grandson of oil magnate John D. Rockefeller Jr., capsized off the coast of Dutch New Guinea. Michael was collecting primitive art for what would become the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Michael C. Rockefeller Wing. When the catamaran capsized, Michael and his companion Ren Wassing held onto the overturned hulls and waited for rescue. After 8 or more hours, Michael decided to swim to shore, approximately 10 to 15 miles away, using improvised flotation. Wassing was subsequently rescued. Michael Rockefeller was never found. The official conclusion was drowning. The Rockefeller family accepted this. A formal search was conducted. No body was ever recovered. The alternative theory which has been investigated by multiple journalists and researchers, most thoroughly by Carl Hoffman in his 2014 book Savage Harvest, proposes that Michael Rockefeller reached shore and was subsequently ended and possibly eaten by members of the Asmat tribe. The basis for this theory includes specific accounts from Asmat people, collected decades later by Catholic missionaries and Dutch government officials, describing the killing of a young white man around the time of Rockefeller's disappearance, and Dutch government documents from the period that refer to incidents involving a white person in the region. The Asmat had a practice of killing outsiders in retribution for specific prior incidents involving Dutch colonial violence. The timing and description in the accounts collected by missionaries correspond to Rockefeller's disappearance. Whether Michael Rockefeller drowned or reached shore and was ended has never been established with certainty. The Rockefeller family has consistently declined to reopen the official conclusion. Story 11, Mohandas Gandhi, spent approximately 20 years in South Africa before returning to India and beginning the nonviolent resistance movements that made him a global symbol of human dignity and civil rights. The South African period is where he developed his philosophy of satyagraha, truth force, and where he founded organizations and conducted campaigns that established the methods he would later deploy in India. It is also where he wrote things about black South Africans that are, by the standards of his own later philosophy and by contemporary standards, contemptible. In petitions and writings from the 1890s, Gandhi described black South Africans using the racial slur used in South Africa at the time, complained about black people being housed in the same facilities as Indian workers, and argued for the separation of Indian and black prisoners in jail. He described black Africans as people who wanted only to pass their days in indolence and sensuality. He advocated specifically for the rights of Indian settlers in South Africa, while treating black South Africans' condition as either irrelevant or as something Indians should be protected from association with. Historians have grappled with this record extensively. Gandhi's later evolution toward a universalism that explicitly embraced all of humanity is real and documented. Whether the earlier views represent a young man of his time and background who had not yet developed his full philosophy, or a troubling aspect of a more complicated person, is a genuine interpretive question. What is not a question is what the documents say. The petitions are in the archives. The words are in the record. Story 12, Mother Teresa won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1979 for her work with the poor in Calcutta, and is widely revered as an exemplar of selfless humanitarian service. She was beatified by Pope John Paul II in 2003 and canonized by Pope Francis in 2016. Multiple independent observers, physicians, journalists, and medical researchers who visited the missionaries of charity homes she founded documented concerns about the standard of medical care provided in those facilities that are not easily reconciled with the image of perfect humanitarian service. British medical journal The Lancet published in 1994 an analysis by physician Robin Fox, who described visiting the homes and finding a lack of proper pain management for dying patients, inadequate medical supervision, and rudimentary conditions that prevented effective treatment. He described nuns and volunteers carrying out medical procedures they were not trained for. He described needles being rinsed rather than sterilized. Physicians Arup Chatterjee and Serge Larive have written more extensive critiques, examining the gap between the funding received by the missionaries of charity, estimated at tens of millions of dollars annually, and the standard of care provided. The missionaries of charity have responded that they provide dignity and spiritual care to the dying poor, many of whom arrive in such condition that medical intervention would be ineffective, and that their mission is not primarily medical. The specific question, whether the resources available to the organization, given its global fundraising capacity, should have been used to provide better medical care than was documented, is one that the Church has not publicly addressed in detail. The work was real. The suffering it addressed was real. The documented concerns about the care provided are also real. Story 13, The War of Currents between Thomas Edison's direct current electrical system and the alternating current system developed by Nikola Tesla and promoted by George Westinghouse is a legitimate chapter of industrial history, a competition between electrical standards with enormous commercial implications. What Edison's team did to try to win that competition goes beyond the bounds of normal competitive behavior. Edison and his associates conducted public electrocution demonstrations using arc current specifically to frighten the public about the safety of the Westinghouse system. Dogs were obtained, sometimes by paying neighborhood children for stray animals, and electrocuted publicly. Calves and horses were electrocuted. In 1903, at Luna Park in Coney Island, an elephant named Topsy was electrocuted with arc current and filmed. Topsy had been condemned by her keepers for having ended several trainers, one of whom had fed her a lit cigarette. She was already scheduled for execution. Edison's associates arranged for the electrocution to be conducted using arc current rather than hanging or another method, and filmed it. The film, electrocuting an elephant, was distributed commercially. Harold Brown, an electrical engineer who was clearly working in coordination with Edison's laboratory, conducted public animal electrocutions and advocated for arc to be used in the electric chair, specifically to create the association between alternating current and death. The association succeeded in branding arc current as the execution current for a period. It ultimately failed commercially. Arc was more practical for long-distance transmission and eventually became the standard. Edison's reputation as an inventor is deserved. The animal electrocution campaign is a documented part of his record that his biography often elides. Story 14. In October 1947, Walt Disney appeared as a friendly witness before the House Un-American Activities Committee, the congressional body investigating communist influence in American life. He testified voluntarily and cooperatively. He named former Disney employees he believed were communist sympathizers, pointing to the 1941 animators' strike as evidence of communist agitation within his studio. The 1941 strike was a legitimate labor dispute. Disney animators had organized under the Screen Cartoonists Guild and were seeking improved pay, screen credits, and better working conditions. Disney initially refused to recognize the union and attempted to prevent the strike. When it succeeded, he attributed the labor organizing to communist influence rather than to genuine workplace grievances. His HUAC testimony named specific individuals. At least some of those named were subsequently blacklisted, unable to find work in the film industry because of the suspicion his testimony attached to their names. Disney's description of the strike's leadership as communist did not accurately characterize what was primarily a wages and credits dispute. The FBI had been gathering information on Disney's employees in the years before HUAC. Disney had apparently been cooperating with the FBI as an informant on suspected communist activity in the film industry prior to his public testimony. The 1941 strike and the HUAC testimony are periods in Disney's history that are rarely discussed in connection with the family-friendly cultural legacy that defines his public image. The animators who went on strike were seeking basic labor protections. The ones Disney named before Congress faced consequences for having done so. Story 16. The image of Ernesto Che Guevara, the famous portrait by Alberto Corda, reproduced on millions of t-shirts, posters, and coffee mugs, is one of the most widely merchandised political images in history. It represents, for many people, romantic revolutionary idealism. The actual Che Guevara's record includes a period of systematic execution that is generally absent from the merchandised version. After the Cuban Revolution succeeded in January 1959, Guevara was appointed commander of La Caba Fortress in Havana and given the responsibility of overseeing trials and executions of those accused of crimes against the revolutionary cause. He held this position from January to June 1959. The trials conducted during this period were not full legal proceedings by the standards of due process. Cuban exile groups and human rights organizations have documented estimates of the number of executions ranging from dozens to several hundred. The figure is disputed. What is less disputed is the nature of the process. Guevara had significant personal authority over outcomes. The proceedings were rapid, and the standard of evidence was not consistent with civilian due process. Guevara himself wrote about the executions with a matter-of-factness that made clear he regarded them as a necessary and justified instrument of revolutionary justice. He was not concealing what happened, he described it. The T-shirt version of Guevara exists in tension with the documented record. Both the person who wrote passionately about human liberation and the person who oversaw executions without full trials are the same person. The merchandise version selects one and omits the other. Story 17: Churchill and Bengal. Historians continue to debate how much his decisions worsened a famine that ended millions. The Bengal famine of 1943, which ended an estimated 2 to 3 million people in British-controlled India, was covered in the Forgotten Tragedies collection. But its specific connection to Churchill's wartime decisions belongs in this context: the question of how much deliberate policy choice, made by a man celebrated as a war hero, contributed to a catastrophic death toll. The historical debate is genuine and ongoing. What is established: India was exporting food during the famine. Requests from the Indian colonial administration for food aid from Britain were either denied or delayed. Churchill made statements about India and Indians that reflected indifference to Indian lives, including an internal remark, documented in his minister's diary, that the famine was the Indians' fault for breeding like rabbits. What is disputed: how much of this reflects deliberate prioritization of British wartime needs over Indian lives, versus how much reflects the genuine constraints of a wartime economy and shipping logistics that were already strained beyond capacity. Churchill's defenders argue that wartime conditions genuinely limited options, and that his focus on defeating Germany was the priority that saved the world. His critics argue that specific decisions, continued grain exports, denial of aid requests, failure to declare a famine officially, reflect choices that cost lives. The 2 to 3 million deaths are not disputed. The causal relationship between Churchill's specific decisions and those deaths is the subject of ongoing scholarly argument. The conventional heroic Churchill narrative does not usually include this chapter. Story 18. George Washington owned enslaved people throughout his life and freed them in his will after his wife Martha's death, which is sometimes presented as evidence of his moral growth regarding slavery. The fuller history of his relationship to the institution is more complicated. Ona Judge was a young woman who had been enslaved in the Washington household since childhood. In May 1796, while the Washingtons were in Philadelphia, she escaped. She made her way to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and began building a free life. Washington attempted to recover her. He directed federal officials in New Hampshire to locate her and return her to his custody. He was unsuccessful, in part because the governor of New Hampshire, John Langdon, declined to cooperate in the way Washington expected, and because Ona Judge, who had married and had children in Portsmouth, had supporters who helped her remain free. Washington expressed frustration at his inability to recover her. In correspondence, he referred to her having been seduced by a Frenchman and complained about the difficulty of recovering fugitive enslaved people from northern states. Ona Judge lived in New Hampshire until her death in 1848. She gave interviews in her old age in which she said she had never regretted leaving, that she had experienced hard times in freedom, but that she preferred liberty with hardship to the comfortable captivity of the president's household. Washington's will freed his enslaved people after Martha's death. It did not free Ona Judge. She was the dower property of Martha Washington's estate and could not be freed by George's will. She obtained her own freedom and was pursued for it. Story 19. Marie Curie died in 1934 from aplastic anemia, an illness caused by her decades of exposure to radioactive materials. She worked extensively with radium and polonium, both of which she discovered at a time when the health risks of radiation exposure were not understood. She carried test tubes of radioactive isotopes in her pockets. She stored radioactive materials in her desk drawers. Everything she touched is still radioactive. Her personal notebooks, the documents in which she recorded her research findings across decades of work, are held in lead-lined boxes at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris. Visitors who wish to consult them must sign a waiver acknowledging the health risks and must wear protective equipment to handle the documents. The notebooks will remain dangerously radioactive for approximately 1,500 years. The half-life of radium-226 is 1,500 years. Her furniture is radioactive. Her cookbooks are radioactive. Her clothing is radioactive. The Curie family home has been decontaminated, a process that required extensive remediation. The specific poignancy of the radioactive notebooks is what they represent, the physical record of her work, still bearing the trace of the materials she handled in producing it, still carrying the contamination that ended her, still accessible only with protective equipment she never wore because she didn't know she needed it. She didn't know what she was handling. The notebooks carry the permanent record of that not knowing in the form of radiation that will outlast every person alive today. Story 20, the FBI's surveillance of Martin Luther King Jr. under J. Edgar Hoover is a documented matter of American history, confirmed by congressional investigation, Freedom of Information Act releases, and the records of the Senate Select Committee of 1975-76. What is less well known is the specific intensity and malice of what that surveillance produced. The FBI designated King as the most dangerous Negro in America and maintained intensive surveillance of him for years, including wiretaps of his phones and microphones placed in hotel rooms. The stated justification was concern about communist influence in the civil rights movement. The actual scope went considerably beyond that. In November 1964, shortly after King received the Nobel Peace Prize, the FBI sent him a package. The package contained recordings made by FBI surveillance, presented as compromising material. The accompanying anonymous letter, which the Church Committee subsequently established, was written in the FBI under the direction of Assistant Director William Sullivan, told King that his end is approaching, and suggested he had 34 days before the material would be made public. The letter told him he was a coward, a fraud, and a filthy, abnormal animal. The final lines of the letter, as reconstructed by historians, suggested that he had only one way out. The letter was an attempt to induce suicide, delivered to a man who was about to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, sent by the Domestic Intelligence Agency of the United States government. King apparently did not open the package until after he returned from Oslo. His wife Coretta later described his reaction. He understood what it was. Story 21, Tesla's final years. The genius who changed the world died alone in a hotel room talking to a pigeon. Nikola Tesla's contributions to electrical engineering are genuinely extraordinary. The alternating current system that powers essentially all electrical infrastructure. The induction motor, the transformer, the radio. He is not underappreciated in the popular sense. He is widely celebrated. The gap is between the mythologist version and the actual final decades. After his productive period in the 1890s and early 1900s, Tesla's life declined sharply. The Wardenclyffe Tower project, his attempt to build a global wireless power transmission system, was abandoned when J.P. Morgan withdrew funding after determining the project was not commercially viable. Tesla was left with a partially built tower and substantial debts. He spent his final 2 decades living in the Hotel New Yorker, running up bills he couldn't pay. He was supported intermittently by various admirers and corporations who recognized his past contributions, but he produced no significant commercial output. His public statements became increasingly eccentric. Claims about a death ray weapon, communications with other planets, theoretical frameworks that other physicists could not engage with productively. In the Hotel New Yorker, he developed a specific attachment to a white female pigeon he cared for daily. He described the pigeon in almost romantic terms in his last writings. He said that when the pigeon died, something went out of my life. The pigeon died in approximately 1940. Tesla died on January 7, 1943, alone in his hotel room, in debt, his patents having largely expired or been lost to legal complications. He was 86. The mythologist version of Tesla is partly deserved and omits how it ended. Story 22, the Vault 7 TV hack. Intelligence agencies can use your smart TV as a surveillance device while it appears off the Weeping Angel tool described in the Vault 7 documents deserves its own specific examination, because the details of how it works are more precise and more disturbing than the general claim that smart TVs can be used for surveillance. According to the CIA documents published by WikiLeaks in 2017, Weeping Angel puts a Samsung smart television in a fake-off mode. The television screen goes dark. Its indicator lights go off. From a visual inspection, the television appears to be powered off. It is not powered off. In fake-off mode, the television's microphone continues to operate and transmit audio to a covert CIA server. The document describes the tool as a joint project between the CIA and the British intelligence service MI5, developed in a workshop conducted in 2014. The document was written in 2014. The specific television model targeted in the leaked documents was the Samsung F8000. The Vault 7 documents do not disclose which, if any, other television models or manufacturers have been targeted with similar techniques. Samsung issued a statement following the Vault 7 release acknowledging the concern and stating that the company's security teams were investigating the matter. They did not confirm or deny whether their televisions had been compromised in the way described. The Vault 7 documents are from 2014. The CIA's technical capabilities in subsequent years are not publicly documented. The documents describe a tool that was operational in 2014, confirmed to exist by the intelligence community's response to the leak, and developed in cooperation with a second intelligence agency. The television in the corner of the room has a microphone. Story 23, the PRISM program, the NSA's collection of data from major technology companies including Google, Apple, Facebook, and Microsoft, was the most widely covered revelation from Edward Snowden's 2013 leaks. It attracted significant public attention and prompted a congressional debate about surveillance that led to some legislative changes. Less widely known from the same set of leaks, X-Keyscore, described in NSA training documents as a system that allows analysts to search nearly everything a typical user does on the internet. The documents describe it as the NSA's widest-reaching system for searching internet communications. Analysts could use it to search email content, browser history, online searches, and other activity by entering a person's name or email address without prior approval, according to the training documents. The NSA disputed the characterization that analysts could access data without prior approval, stating that all queries required a legal basis and were audited. The training documents, as published, do not reflect the procedural steps that the NSA described as required. A separate program described in the Snowden leaks, Muscular, operated jointly with the British GHQ, tapped into the private data links between Google and Yahoo's overseas data centers, intercepting traffic between those companies' servers that was not subject to PRISM's oversight because it was collected outside the United States. The NSA's position is that its surveillance activities are conducted under legal authority and appropriate oversight. The Snowden documents describe a surveillance capability whose full scope remains disputed between the agency and the people who reviewed the documents. Story 24, Leonard Peltier, is an American Indian movement activist who has been imprisoned since 1977 for the murders of 2 FBI agents, Jack Kohler and Ronald Williams, who were ended during a confrontation on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota on June 26, 1975. He maintains he is innocent. Amnesty International has designated him a political prisoner. The United Nations Human Rights Committee has expressed concern about his conviction. He is one of the most prominent long-term prisoners in American history. The case against Peltier was built substantially on the testimony of a witness, whose later recantations were not available to the jury. A ballistics report that the prosecution presented as linking Peltier's rifle to the killings was later found in a document obtained through FOIA requests to contain a conclusion that contradicted the testimony given at trial. The prosecution withheld this document from the defense. Federal prosecutors subsequently acknowledged, in a 1985 court filing, that they had no direct evidence that Peltier had personally ended the agents. The question that has been argued in court and in public for 50 years: what does it mean to maintain a conviction that was built on evidence that was withheld, supported by testimony that was recanted, and acknowledged by prosecutors to lack the direct evidence that was presented to the jury? The government's position is that the conviction was valid, that Peltier was present at the scene, and that sufficient evidence supports his guilt. Peltier's supporters argue that the case reflects Coinelpro's targeting of AIM, and that he has been imprisoned for political reasons. He was born in 1944. He is in his early 80s. Story 25: Operation Merlin. The CIA fed Iran defective nuclear blueprints and accidentally made the program better. Operation Merlin was a CIA operation first reported by journalist James Risen in his 2006 book, State of War. The operation, as described in Risen's reporting, involved using a Russian defector to deliver deliberately flawed nuclear weapon designs to Iran, with the intent of sabotaging Iran's nuclear weapons program by causing Iranian scientists to pursue technical approaches that would fail. The problem, as reported by Risen, the Russian defector, before delivering the blueprints to Iranian officials, apparently pointed out some of the flaws in the documents. The CIA's plan assumed the defector would deliver the flawed designs as if they were genuine. Instead, by marking some flaws, the defector may have allowed Iranian scientists to identify and potentially correct the mistakes, potentially providing them with genuine technical assistance rather than sabotage. The CIA denied and disputed various aspects of Risen's reporting. The operation itself, to the extent it existed as described, was classified. What happened to the man who reported it, Jeffrey Sterling, a CIA officer, was prosecuted under the Espionage Act for allegedly being Risen's source for the Merlin story. He was convicted in 2015 and sentenced to 3.5 years in prison. The prosecution required the government to confirm, by implication of prosecuting the leak, that the operation existed. Operation Merlin represents a specific category of covert action, an attempt at nuclear sabotage that may have backfired, reported by a journalist who relied on a source who was subsequently imprisoned. The existence of the operation confirmed by the prosecution of the source. Story 26: Columbus's own records of violence. His journals describe what he did to the Taino people. The standard Columbus narrative: brave explorer, discoverer of a new world, man of his time, rests partly on what it selects from the documentary record and partly on what it omits. Columbus's own journals and administrative records, and the records of his contemporaries, describe what he did to the Taino people of Hispaniola in considerable detail. Columbus established a system called the encomienda, a forced labor system in which Taino people were required to deliver specific quotas of gold to Spanish authorities. Those who failed to deliver their quota had their hands cut off. Columbus's administration distributed Taino people to Spanish colonists essentially as property. Bartolomé de las Casas, a Spanish priest who accompanied early colonial expeditions and later became an advocate for indigenous rights, documented the violence in specific detail. He described mass killings, mutilations, the destruction of communities. He was not an opponent of the colonial project initially. He was a colonist who became horrified by what he witnessed. The Spanish crown received complaints about Columbus's governance from the colonists themselves, not from indigenous people, who had no access to that channel, and sent a royal administrator, Francisco de Bobadilla, to Hispaniola in 1500. Bobadilla found Columbus had ordered the hanging of Spanish colonists without trial, and was administering the colony with violence that even his own colonists found excessive. Columbus was arrested and returned to Spain in chains. He was eventually released. His titles and privileges were partially restored through legal proceedings, though he never regained governance of Hispaniola. These events are in the historical record. They were documented by the Spanish colonial administration at the time. Story 27, The Black Dahlia, an unsolved 1947 murder that has generated more proposed explanations than almost any other Elizabeth Short's murder on January 15, 1947. Her body found bisected, drained of blood, and carefully staged in a Los Angeles vacant lot is one of the most extensively investigated and most elaborately theorized cold cases in American criminal history. The case has attracted attention for 75 years and has produced, at minimum, dozens of different named suspects and multiple credible books arguing for different resolutions. What is established, Short was 22 years old. She had been murdered elsewhere, and her body moved to the location where it was found. The bisection was performed with precision suggesting medical or butchery knowledge. The body had been thoroughly washed. She had been held alive for days before her death, based on the state of the injuries. The investigation at the time was among the most extensive in Los Angeles Police Department history. Hundreds of detectives assigned, thousands of interviews conducted, over 150 people confessing to the murder. The lapsed suspect files from the original investigation remained partially classified for decades. The Black Dahlia case has an unusual subsequent history. It was used as the basis for James Ellroy's novel and subsequent film, the fictional treatment becoming so culturally dominant that it sometimes overwrites the actual case in public memory. Ellroy's father was investigated as a suspect in a different Los Angeles murder. This biographical connection adds a specific texture to his engagement with the case. Steve Hodel, a former lap detective, published a series of books arguing that his own father, Dr. George Hodel, was responsible. The handwriting analysis and circumstantial evidence he presents is taken seriously by some investigators and disputed by others. Short was murdered. The case is open. The person responsible has not been identified. Story 28, The NSA's continuity of government plans. Members of Congress complain about being kept in the dark continuity of government. The planning for how the U.S. federal government would function in the event of a catastrophic attack, including nuclear strike, involves a set of classified protocols, underground facilities, and succession plans that have been publicly acknowledged to exist in general terms while remaining classified in most of their specifics. The existence of the Mount Weather Emergency Operations Center in Virginia and the Raven Rock Mountain Complex in Pennsylvania is public knowledge. The existence of classified relocation plans for senior executive branch officials and selected members of Congress is public knowledge. The general framework of who succeeds to the presidency under various circumstances is codified in law. What is not publicly known, and what has prompted specific objections from members of Congress over the years, the specific details of who is in the protected succession, what authority structures would operate in a continuity scenario, and specifically whether Congress's constitutional role would be maintained or effectively suspended in a continuity of government emergency. In 2002, Representative Peter DeFazio, a member of the House Homeland Security Committee, was denied access to the classified continuity of government annexes by the Bush administration. Access he was seeking as part of his committee oversight responsibilities. He publicly complained about being kept in the dark about plans that would directly affect how Congress would function in an emergency. The specific character of what's being withheld from congressional oversight, from the people who would nominally be part of the government that was continuing, is the specific thing that makes the continuity of government planning a distinct category of classified material. The bunkers exist. The plans exist. What the plans say remains classified from some of the people they concern. Story 29, The 1968 DNC. FBI informants were embedded in protest groups and may have helped escalate the confrontations between police and protesters at the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago, which was broadcast live on national television and produced images of uniformed officers beating protesters in the streets outside the convention hall, are a documented historical event that played a significant role in the politics of the era. What the standard account often omits is the extent to which the protest groups involved had been infiltrated by FBI informants, and the specific questions that raises about what role those informants played. The FBI's COINTELPRO program had been specifically targeting the activist groups that planned to protest the convention, most significantly Students for a Democratic Society, the Yippies, and the National Mobilization Committee to End the War in Vietnam. Informants were embedded in these organizations. The extent to which informants reported on planning, potentially, altered plans, or took actions designed to escalate confrontations is a question that has been investigated by historians without being definitively settled. The Chicago 8 trial that followed the convention violence included testimony about provocateurs, people who identified themselves as part of the protest community, but whose actions appeared designed to escalate rather than demonstrate. Whether any of these individuals were working for law enforcement was alleged at trial, but not established to the satisfaction of the courts. The violence at the 1968 convention shaped American politics for a generation. The Kerner Commission report called the confrontation a police riot. The full picture of how many actors in that scene were working for or with law enforcement and what they were doing remains incompletely established. Story 30, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum heist. The empty frames have hung for 34 years, and the reward is unclaimed. This entry was covered earlier in this collection, but the specific detail that belongs specifically in a hiding in plain sight context deserves its own treatment. The empty frames. Isabella Stewart Gardner's will specified that the collection in her museum must be displayed exactly as she arranged it during her lifetime. The staff must follow her arrangement. The empty frames, the frames from which the Vermeer, the Rembrandts, the Degas drawings were cut, must remain on the walls, so they hang there. Every visitor to the Gardner Museum walks past 13 empty frames. The frames are where the paintings were. They mark the specific dimensions of the objects that were taken. They are not storage or administrative objects. They are displayed, according to the terms of the will, in the positions where Gardner arranged them. The effect is a permanent exhibition of a theft. The museum exists in a condition of documented loss that its founder's will requires it to maintain. The frames cannot be removed without violating the trust. The stolen paintings cannot fill them because the paintings haven't been found. The museum has been in this condition since 1990. The FBI's investigation has named, at various points, members of the Boston organized crime network associated with James Whitey Bulger as likely involved. The trail has led to Europe at various points. The $10 million reward, now the largest private reward for stolen property in history, has attracted tips, investigations, and claims, none of which has produced the paintings. The frames hang in the Gardner Museum today. The theft is displayed alongside the remaining collection, permanently. Story 31. The October surprise theory holds that officials from Ronald Reagan's 1980 presidential campaign, possibly including future CIA Director William Casey, made secret contact with Iranian officials during the hostage crisis, negotiating to delay the release of the 52 American hostages held since November 1979 until after the November election, thus preventing Jimmy Carter from benefiting from a pre-election hostage release. The hostages were released on January 20th, 1981, the day of Reagan's inauguration, within minutes of his taking office. The theory has been investigated multiple times. A 1992 Senate task force and a House task force both investigated and found insufficient evidence to conclude a deal had been made. The investigations were conducted during a politically charged period, and their conclusions were disputed by some investigators who believed the evidence had not been fully explored. The specific evidence that has kept the theory alive, testimony from various Iranian officials and American figures claiming they witnessed or participated in meetings between Reagan campaign representatives and Iranian officials in 1980. Former Iranian President Abul Hassan Bani Sadr claimed to have knowledge of the contacts. The timing of the release, literally coordinated with the inauguration, is difficult to attribute to coincidence by the theory's proponents. The counter-argument, the Iran-Contra affair's arms sales to Iran, which began in 1985, have been separately established. Some historians argue there's a logical connection between an alleged 1980 deal and the 1985 sales. Others argue they were separate and unrelated. The two congressional investigations found insufficient evidence. Some historians believe the investigation was itself insufficient. The question has not been closed to everyone's satisfaction. Story 32: The disappearance of Jean Spangler. A Hollywood actress left home for a film shoot and left behind a cryptic torn note on October 7, 1949. Jean Spangler, a 26-year-old actress and dancer who had appeared in small roles in Hollywood productions, left her home in Los Angeles, telling her sister-in-law she was going to meet her ex-husband about child support payments, and then possibly to work a night filming scene. She left behind her young daughter. She was never seen again. Her purse was found 2 days later in Griffith Park. Inside the purse was a torn note. The note read, "Kirk, can't wait any longer, going to see Dr. Scott. It will work best this way while Mother is away." The note appeared to be the beginning of a longer message. It was torn, and the rest was not found. The name Kirk attracted immediate attention. Kirk Douglas was a rising Hollywood star who had appeared in a film with Spangler. He was questioned. He denied knowing what the note referred to. No connection between Douglas and Spangler's disappearance was ever established. The identity of Kirk in the note was never confirmed. The identity of Dr. Scott and what procedure Spangler intended to see the doctor for was also investigated. The most commonly proposed interpretation is that the note references an illegal abortion, which would have been both criminal and dangerous in 1949. No doctor named Scott matching the investigation's parameters was ever identified. No trace of Jean Spangler was ever found. No confirmed witness came forward who had seen her after she left her home on October 7. The note in her purse is the only evidence of what she was planning. Story 33: The murder of Bob Crane. The star of Hogan's Heroes was bludgeoned to death, and the case took decades to almost resolve. On June 29, 1978, Bob Crane, star of the television series Hogan's Heroes, was found bludgeoned to death in his apartment in Scottsdale, Arizona. He was 49 years old. A cord had been wrapped around his neck after death. He had been ended while sleeping. Crane had a complicated private life that was significantly at odds with his public image as the affable hero of a World War II comedy. He had a substantial collection of home video recordings of his encounters, and the investigation found that a friend and business associate named John Carpenter had a similar obsession and had been with Crane in the days before his death. Carpenter was tried for the murder in 1994, 16 years after the crime, on the basis of forensic analysis that claimed to find biological material consistent with blood on the inside of Carpenter's rental car from the time of the murder. He was acquitted. The forensic evidence was contested. The jury found it insufficient. Carpenter denied involvement throughout. He died in 1998. The case was featured in the 2002 film Autofocus, which dramatized Crane's private life and his friendship with Carpenter. The film's version of events assigns responsibility more clearly than the trial did. Bob Crane was murdered in his apartment. The person responsible has not been convicted. Carpenter was the primary suspect throughout the investigation and was acquitted at trial. Whether the acquittal reflects his innocence or the limitations of the forensic evidence available after a 16-year gap is a question the legal proceedings did not resolve. The case is formally unsolved. Story 34: The Sodder Children Case was covered in the Creepiest Mysteries collection, but the specific image of the billboard belongs here. The Sodder family's monument to their refusal to accept an explanation that didn't add up. After Christmas Eve 1945, when 5 of their 10 children disappeared in a house fire, and no remains were found in the ash, and a liver survived the blaze intact, and the ladder used to reach upper windows had disappeared, and a woman reported seeing the children alive the following day, George and Jenny Sodder did something that lasted until George died in 1968. They put up a billboard on Route 16. The billboard featured photographs of the 5 missing children, and photographs of what they might look like as adults. It asked anyone who recognized them to contact the family. It offered a $5,000 reward, a substantial sum for the era. The billboard stood for approximately 20 years on a West Virginia highway, a permanent public statement by two parents who had decided that the official explanation was wrong and who would not accept it. They were not wrong to be suspicious. The specific evidence that made them suspicious, the liver, the missing ladder, the survivor sightings, was real evidence that was inadequately investigated. Whether their suspicion was correct, whether some or all of their children survived the fire and were taken somewhere, was never established. The billboard came down. George Sauter died, still searching. Jenny Sauter lived until 1989, outlasting her husband, still waiting for an answer that did not come. The photograph of the children is still in public archives. The question of what happened to them is still open. Story 35, the Jade Helm 15 Panic. A routine military exercise became a conspiracy crisis because of social media in the spring of 2015. The U.S. Army Special Operations Command announced a planned multi-state training exercise called Jade Helm 15, which would involve approximately 1,200 soldiers conducting training across several western states: Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Colorado, Nevada, and California. The exercise was designated as a realistic military training scenario and would involve soldiers operating in civilian areas. What followed was a significant episode of conspiracy-driven social media panic that reached the level of official governmental response. Within weeks of the announcement, social media posts had developed an elaborate interpretation of Jade Helm 15 as the beginning of a federal government takeover, specifically, a military occupation of Texas. Abandoned Walmart stores were claimed to be detention facilities. Symbols on a map of the exercise were claimed to indicate which states were hostile and would be occupied. The participation of U.S. Special Operations Forces in civilian areas was claimed to indicate preparations for martial law. Texas Governor Greg Abbott ordered the Texas State Guard to monitor the exercise to ensure that Texans' rights and liberties would be preserved. This was an official state government response to a conspiracy theory about a routine training exercise. Jade Helm 15 concluded in September 2015 without incident. The episode is studied as a case study in how conspiracy theories spread through social media and how they can produce real governmental responses even when they are entirely false. The specific dynamics, a real government event with real documents and maps, subjected to interpretive frameworks that transformed mundane details into evidence of sinister plans, reflects something about how information environments change what happens when governments do things in public. Story 36, the disappearance of the SS Waratah. 211 people vanished between South African ports and no confirmed wreckage was ever found in July 1909. The SS Waratah departed Durban on the South African coast bound for Cape Town, carrying approximately 211 passengers and crew. It never arrived. No confirmed trace of the ship or any of its passengers has ever been found. The Waratah was a relatively new ship, only launched in 1908, built for the Australian passenger trade, and making only its second voyage. It had attracted some concern before its disappearance. A passenger named Claude Sawyer had disembarked at Durban, foregoing his onwards booking, and later claimed he had experienced dreams and visions suggesting the ship would sink. He had found the ship's stability concerning. The loss of the Waratah is sometimes called Australia's Titanic, an ocean liner swallowed by the sea with all aboard, leaving nothing to explain what happened. Unlike the Titanic, there is no debris field, no recovered wreckage of any significance, no survivors, and no account of the final moments. The Titanic sank, leaving hundreds of floating survivors, recovered wreckage, and an identified resting place. The Waratah left nothing. Search expeditions were conducted in 1910, 1955, 1983, 1987, and various subsequent years. Several potential wreck sites were investigated using sonar. none produced confirmed identification of the Waratah's remains. The leading theories: the ship was struck by a rogue wave. Extraordinarily large waves generated by specific sea conditions are documented in the waters off South Africa, or experienced some other catastrophic event that caused rapid sinking before any distress signal could be sent. 211 people. No wreckage. No signal. The sea off South Africa kept whatever it took. Story 37. Barbara Newhall Follett was a remarkable child. She had begun typing original stories at age 5, had lost her first manuscript in a house fire, and completely rewritten it from memory at age 8, and had a novel published when she was 12 years old. She had been featured in newspapers as a prodigy. She had learned multiple languages, sailed, and hiked extensively. She was, in every observable respect, a person with exceptional capability and energy. In December 1939, at age 25, she had an argument with her husband Nickerson Rogers. She left her apartment in Brookline, Massachusetts, with $30 and whatever she was wearing. She was never seen again. No confirmed sighting. No activity in her financial accounts. No contact with her mother, to whom she had been exceptionally close throughout her life. Her mother searched for her for the rest of her life and never found a trace. The absence of a confirmed explanation is specifically strange, given Follett's capabilities and connections. She was not a person without resources or contacts. She spoke multiple languages. She had sailed and hiked alone in various environments. If she chose to disappear, she had the skills and the network to construct a new life. If something happened to her against her will, there is similarly no trace. Her mother, Sabra Follett, collected and preserved Barbara's papers and manuscripts, and spent years seeking a publisher for her work. Believing her daughter might one day return to find her work had been preserved. Sabra died in 1970 without learning what had happened to her daughter. The books Barbara wrote as a child are still occasionally reprinted. She walked out of her apartment in 1939. She hasn't been found. Story 38. The South Nahanni River in the Northwest Territories of Canada flows through one of the most remote and striking landscapes in North America. Steep canyons, hot springs, and the Virginia Falls, which are nearly twice the height of Niagara. The valley was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1978. It is also the location of a pattern of deaths and disappearances that has never been fully explained. The deaths began in the early 20th century, during the Gold Rush era, when prospectors were exploring the region. The first widely noted case was the McLeod brothers, who in 1908 were found decapitated. Their bodies were located, but their heads were not. 2 later prospectors were also found decapitated. The valley acquired the nickname Headless Valley, which has attracted more sensational attention than the actual documented cases warrant. The documented pattern over the following decades includes additional prospector deaths and disappearances in the valley, most of which have mundane explanations. Wilderness is dangerous, but some of which share specific characteristics that have attracted attention: bodies found in unexpected locations, deaths occurring to experienced wilderness travelers, some cases where the cause of death was not clearly established. The Dene First Nations people of the region have traditional knowledge of the valley and have stories about dangerous entities associated with it. Their accounts are sometimes cited in popular treatments of the mystery, in ways that strip out their cultural context. Whether the Nahanni Valley has a genuine pattern of unexplained deaths distinct from the normal hazards of a remote wilderness, or whether the pattern is a selection bias applied to coincidences, is a question the available evidence doesn't cleanly resolve. The valley is beautiful and remote. People have died there in unclear circumstances. Story 39. Between 1964 and 1965, at least 6 women, all workers, were murdered in London and their bodies deposited in or near the River Thames. The killer was identified in the press as Jack the Stripper because the bodies were found nude. The murders occurred despite an extraordinarily intensive Metropolitan Police investigation that involved taking fingerprints from thousands of men and conducting surveillance operations across London. The specificity of the evidence pointed toward an industrial location, Residue on the bodies was consistent with spray paint used in a specific kind of factory. The bodies' temperatures when found were consistent with having been stored somewhere warm before disposal. The Metropolitan Police identified an industrial area near the river as potentially relevant. Several suspects were investigated. Commander John Doe Rose, who led the investigation, wrote in his memoirs that he had narrowed the field to 3 suspects and that one of them committed suicide before he could be arrested. He implied this was the killer. The identity of this person has been disputed by researchers. A boxing promoter named Frederick Muncie was suspected and investigated during the original investigation. He died in 1979. The murders stopped. Whether because the killer died, moved away, was imprisoned for something else, or simply stopped, is not known. The case is formally unsolved. 6 women were murdered, and none of their killers has been identified or prosecuted. The Metropolitan Police's investigation, which was one of the largest in London's history up to that point, did not produce a conviction. The women who were ended are named: Hannah Tailford, Irene Lockwood, Helen Barthélemy, Mary Fleming, Frances Brown, and Bridget O'Hara. Story 40, What's Hiding in Plain Sight? The thing every entry on this list has in common: we've been through 39 entries. A private organization infiltrated the U.S. federal government, and it's in the court records. An intelligence agency's smart TV hacking tool. A whistleblower prosecuted for reporting government waste. A family's missing children on a billboard for 20 years. A 9-foot shark eaten by something bigger. The letters the FBI sent to Martin Luther King. Edison's animal electroculations. Gandhi's early racism. Churchill and Bengal. The radioactive notebooks in the lead-lined boxes. The empty frames in the Gardner Museum. The US Waratah's 211 missing people. 6 murdered women in London whose killer was never found. What these have in common is not that they were hidden. Most of them were in some sense available. In court records, in historical archives, in official files, in the newspaper, on the museum wall. Some of them were reported and then ignored. Some are simply aspects of historical figures that don't fit into the preferred narrative. The hiding in plain sight is not a conspiracy. It's a selection effect. History is large and attention is limited. The things that make it into the standard account are things that fit, that serve a story, that are emotionally legible, that don't complicate the narrative too much. The things that don't fit get left in the archive. The court records of Operation Snow White are in the public archive. The Gardner Museum's empty frames are in the public gallery. Marie Curie's radioactive notebooks are accessible in lead-lined boxes to anyone who signs the waiver. The FBI letter to Martin Luther King has been documented by the Church Committee and described in major news publications. None of this requires a cover-up. It requires only that attention is selective, that uncomfortable facts are easier to omit than to integrate, and that the stories we tell about the world tend to be simpler than the world actually is. The most disturbing thing hiding in plain sight is usually not a secret. It's a fact that's been sitting in the record the whole time, waiting for someone to look at it